400,000 years. That's how long our closest cousins endured winters that would kill us in days. While you bundle up against a 20-degree morning, they faced temperatures that dropped to -40, -50 degrees Fahrenheit. For 400 millennia, they didn't just survive, they thrived. Here's the paradox that should keep you awake tonight. The same species that conquered the most brutal climate in human history disappeared, not from cold, but from competition. Not from ice, but from us. If you're here to fall asleep, perfect, you're in the right place. Let this story carry you through the snow-covered millennia, where survival was an art form and every dawn was earned. Tell me your city and what time it is there. I love reading them. Whether you're in Tokyo at midnight or Los Angeles at lunch, we're all descendants of survivors. Tonight, we discover how the greatest survivors in human history made it through 400,000 winters that would break us. Picture this. While your ancestors huddled around fires in Africa, learning to chip stone into tools, another branch of our family tree was already mastering the impossible. They were living through ice ages that lasted tens of thousands of years. They were raising children in climates where your breath froze before it left your lungs. They were building communities in a world where summer meant a brief reprieve from death, and winter meant 8 months of survival against impossible odds. The Neanderthals didn't just endure 400,000 years of Ice Age winters. They didn't merely survive them. They conquered them so completely that when archaeologists dig up their remains today, they find evidence of thriving communities, sophisticated tools, and careful burial practices. These weren't desperate refugees clinging to existence. These were masters of their frozen world. But here's what makes their story so extraordinary. They did it all without the one thing we consider essential for survival: agriculture. No crops, no stored grain, no domesticated animals. Just stone, fire, and an unbreakable will to see another dawn. You know that feeling when winter seems to drag on forever? When February feels like it's been going for 6 months, and you start to question if spring will ever come. Multiply that by 100, multiply that by 1,000. That was their normal. That was Tuesday for a Neanderthal. The timeline alone should make you pause. 400,000 years ago, while early humans in Africa were still figuring out how to make consistent fire, Neanderthals in Europe were already building shelters that could withstand blizzards that lasted for weeks. They were developing hunting strategies for animals so massive they could feed a family for months. They were creating tools so perfectly adapted to Ice Age survival that some of their designs wouldn't be improved upon for hundreds of thousands of years. Think about the mathematics of their existence. If a Neanderthal lived to be 30 years old, a respectable age in their world, they would have survived 30 winters. 30 seasons where the wrong decision, the failed hunt, the broken tool, or the collapsed shelter meant death. Not just for them, but for their children, their partners, their entire family group. And they did this not once, not twice, but across 400,000 years. That's roughly 16,000 generations of humans who looked at impossible cold and said, "We'll figure it out." 16,000 generations who passed down not just genes but knowledge, stories, techniques, the accumulated wisdom of survival that you and I can barely imagine. Consider what that means. Every Neanderthal child who grew to adulthood represented a victory against conditions that would hospitalize modern humans within hours. Every elderly Neanderthal who died of old age rather than cold or starvation represented decades of successful winters. Every tool they left behind represents a solution to a problem that could have meant extinction. But here's the question that should fascinate you as you drift towards sleep. How did they do it? What did they know that we've forgotten? What skills did they develop that seem almost magical to us now? The answer isn't simple. It wasn't just one adaptation, one trick, one clever innovation. It was everything. It was bodies built like biological furnaces. It was tools designed with the precision of Swiss watches and the durability of tank armor. It was hunting strategies so sophisticated they could bring down animals 10 times their size. It was shelters that turned frozen caves into warm havens. It was communities built on cooperation so tight that individual survival was impossible and group survival was inevitable. They understood something we've forgotten in our heated homes and insulated cars. Survival isn't about avoiding hardship, it's about becoming so perfectly adapted to hardship that it becomes just another day. They didn't see winter as something to endure. They saw it as the stage where they performed the daily miracle of staying alive, and perform they did. For 400,000 years, through ice ages that would have crushed civilizations, through climate changes that would have ended empires, through conditions that would have scattered lesser species to extinction, they performed the greatest show in human history, the show of persistence. Tonight, as you listen to this story, you're warm, you're safe, you're fed, you're sheltered. You take these things for granted because your species learned to take them for granted. But the Neanderthals never could. For them, warmth was earned, safety was constructed, food was hunted, shelter was built with their own hands from the bones and stones of their frozen world. They are the reason the phrase survival of the fittest means something, not because they were the strongest, though they were incredibly strong, not because they were the smartest, though they were remarkably clever, but because they were the most adapted, the most persistent, the most willing to do whatever it took to see another sunrise over a world that wanted them dead. Their promise to us, across 400,000 years, is simple: it can be done. Whatever impossible thing you're facing, whatever challenge seems insurmountable, whatever winter of your life feels endless, it can be survived, it can be conquered. It can be transformed from an enemy into just another day, because they did it. For 400,000 winters they did it. Part 2. A world of endless cold. Close your eyes and try to imagine a world where winter never truly ends, where the warmest day of summer barely reaches the temperature of your refrigerator, where ice sheets stretch to the horizon like frozen oceans, and the only green you'll see are the hardy mosses that peek through snow for 3 precious weeks each year. This wasn't the world of some distant planet. This was Europe. This was Asia. This was home to the Neanderthals for 400,000 years. Picture standing outside right now, in whatever weather you're experiencing, and multiplying the cold by 10. Then imagine that's not winter, that's July. The Ice Age world wasn't just cold. It was a fundamentally different planet, a world where glaciers moved like slow rivers, carving valleys and crushing forests beneath billions of tons of ice. A world where the very geography changed with the seasons, where rivers froze solid for 8 months of the year, where the line between survival and death was measured not in days or hours, but in the warmth of your next breath. The Neanderthals woke up every morning in this world and had to solve the same equation we face when we're camping and forget our sleeping bag. Except their equation wasn't, how do I stay comfortable for one night? Their equation was, how does my entire family stay alive until spring? And spring was still 4 months away. And spring, when it came, would last about 6 weeks before the cold returned. You know that moment in a blizzard when the wind cuts through your jacket and you realize how thin the barrier is between you and freezing? That was every morning for them. Except they didn't have jackets. They had animal skins they'd prepared themselves. They didn't have central heating. They had fires they had to build and maintain with wood they'd gathered and dried during the brief summer months. The world they inhabited was a predator. Not just full of predators, though it was, but actually predatory itself. The cold actively hunted them. Every calorie they burned staying warm was a calorie they couldn't use for hunting, for building, for thinking, for loving their children. The environment wasn't neutral, it was hostile. It woke up every day trying to kill them, and they woke up every day refusing to die. Think about the resources available to them. No grocery stores, obviously. No stored food beyond what they could preserve themselves. But more than that, no reliable food sources at all. The plant foods that sustained humans in warmer climates were buried under ice for most of the year. The trees that provided nuts and fruits existed only in memory and brief summer glimpses. They lived in a world of carnivores, not by choice, but by necessity. When plant food disappears for 8 months at a time, you either learn to hunt or you starve. But hunting in the Ice Age wasn't like hunting today. The animals they pursued weren't deer and rabbits. They were mammoths weighing 6 tons, woolly rhinoceroses with horns longer than spears, cave bears that stood 9 feet tall and saw humans as potential meals rather than threats. Every hunting expedition was a military campaign. Every successful hunt was a victory against impossible odds. Every failed hunt brought them closer to starvation, and starvation in the Ice Age didn't mean discomfort, it meant death for everyone you loved. The weather itself was weaponized. Blizzards didn't just bring snow, they brought whiteout conditions that could last for days, where you could freeze to death 3 feet from your shelter because you couldn't find it. Winds carried temperatures so low they could freeze exposed skin in minutes. And this wasn't rare weather, this was Tuesday. But here's what's remarkable. They didn't just survive this world, they made it home. Archaeological evidence shows they weren't just desperately clinging to life in caves, waiting for conditions to improve. They were having children, they were creating art. They were developing complex social structures. They were innovating, creating new tools, refining old techniques, passing knowledge between generations. They learned to read the sky like a survival manual. Cloud formations that meant a 3-day blizzard. Wind patterns that indicated whether the hunting would be possible. Star positions that told them how many weeks until the brief summer thaw. They became weather prophets by necessity. Your weather app tells you if you need an umbrella. Their weather reading told them if their family would live or die. The animals they shared this world with were equally adapted to impossibility. Woolly mammoths with fur so thick it was like wearing a house. Saber-toothed cats with reflexes honed by generations of Ice Age hunting. Cave bears that hibernated through the worst months, emerging in spring desperate and dangerous. And the Neanderthals? They didn't hibernate. They couldn't migrate to warmer climates. They couldn't dig underground and wait for better conditions. They had to stay awake, stay active, stay hunting and gathering and building and maintaining their communities through every month of every winter of every year for 400,000 years. The permafrost beneath their feet held the frozen remains of forests from warmer times. Sometimes they could see, preserved in ice, the remnants of a world that had been green and abundant. But that world was as distant to them as the surface of Mars is to us. They lived in the world they had, not the world they might have wished for. Every sunrise was earned, every sunset was survived. Every winter was a war they fought with stone tools and animal skins, and the kind of stubborn persistence that refuses to accept impossibility as an answer. This was their world, this was their daily reality. This was the stage where they performed the greatest survival story in human history, and tomorrow we'll discover how they did it. Part 3. Bodies built for winter. Imagine if evolution was a personal trainer, and it spent 400,000 years sculpting the perfect winter athlete. What would that athlete look like? They'd be shorter to conserve heat, stockier to generate warmth, more muscular to survive the incredible demands of Ice Age life. They'd have larger noses to warm incoming air, broader rib cages to house bigger lungs, and bones so dense they could withstand stresses that would shatter your skeleton. You're imagining a Neanderthal, but here's what's extraordinary. They weren't designed in some laboratory. They were forged by winter itself. Every bone in their body, every muscle fiber, every adaptation was shaped by 400,000 years of the simple equation, adapt or die. And they chose adaptation so completely that their bodies became biological masterpieces of cold weather survival. Let's start with something you can feel right now. Put your hand on your chest and feel your rib cage. Notice how it tapers toward the bottom. Now imagine that same rib cage, but broader, deeper, more barrel-shaped. That was a Neanderthal chest. It wasn't just bigger for show, it was bigger for survival. Those expanded lungs weren't just processing the thin, cold air of Ice Age Europe, they were warming it. Every breath they took came in at temperatures that would shock your system. But their larger nasal passages and bigger lung capacity meant they could preheat that air before it reached their cores. They were walking, breathing heating systems. Think about the energy demands of staying warm in sub-zero temperatures. Your body burns calories just maintaining your core temperature when it's cold outside. Now multiply that by the kind of cold they lived in, and extend it across 8 months of the year. A modern human in those conditions would need to consume thousands of extra calories just to avoid freezing to death. But Neanderthals had solved this problem at the biological level. Their bodies were more efficient furnaces. Their shorter, stockier builds meant less surface area, losing heat to the environment. Every calorie they consumed was maximized for warmth generation. They were built like wood-burning stoves, designed to extract every possible BTU from their fuel. And speaking of fuel, let's talk about their muscles. You think you know what strong looks like? Neanderthal arm bones show muscle attachment points that indicate strength levels we can barely comprehend. These weren't gym muscles built for appearance, these were functional muscles built for survival. Muscles that could thrust spears through mammoth hide. Muscles that could drag 100-pound hunks of meat back to camp. Muscles that could work for hours in conditions that would exhaust modern humans in minutes. But strength without endurance is useless in an ice age. You can't just be strong for an hour when the hunt might last for days. Archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthal bones show stress markers consistent with incredible cardiovascular endurance. They were built like marathon runners, if marathon runners also had to carry refrigerators while they ran. Here's something that might surprise you. Their bones were denser than yours. Not just a little denser, significantly denser. Dense enough that when archaeologists first discovered Neanderthal remains, they thought they were looking at the bones of people with bone diseases. But that density wasn't pathological, it was adaptive. Those dense bones could withstand the incredible stresses of Ice Age life without breaking. Think about what that means practically. Every time they made a tool, they were striking stone with enough force to shape flint. Every time they hunted, they were throwing spears with enough power to penetrate thick hides. Every time they walked across uneven, frozen terrain, carrying heavy loads, their skeletons absorbed impacts that would send you to the emergency room. Their skulls tell an equally remarkable story. Larger brain cases, yes, but also incredibly thick bone structure around the eyes and forehead. These weren't just protective features, they were engineering solutions. Thick brow ridges that could absorb the impact of what? What were they protecting against that required bone structure like medieval armor? The answer is simple: everything. In their world, head injuries weren't just occupational hazards, they were daily possibilities. Wrestling with large prey, working in close quarters with stone tools, living in environments where a fall on ice could mean the difference between life and death. But perhaps most remarkably, their bodies were built for efficiency in ways that go beyond strength and endurance. Their metabolisms were calibrated for feast or famine cycles. When food was abundant, they could process enormous quantities and store the energy efficiently. When food was scarce, they could slow their metabolism to stretch resources across weeks of lean hunting. Modern humans crash diet and call it challenging. Neanderthals lived through regular cycles of abundance and scarcity that would hospitalize us. Their bodies treated these cycles as normal operating procedure. You know how you feel after a particularly brutal workout? That deep muscle fatigue, that bone-tired exhaustion, that was their baseline. That was Tuesday afternoon for a Neanderthal, and they got up Wednesday morning and did it again. But here's what's most important to understand. These weren't random adaptations. These weren't accidents of evolution. Every single physical characteristic was a solution to a specific survival problem. Short stature solved heat retention. Dense bones solved durability. Powerful muscles solved the problem of hunting megafauna. Large lung capacity solved the problem of breathing frozen air. They were purpose-built for impossibility. 400,000 years of winter had created the most perfectly adapted cold-weather humans who ever lived. Their bodies were their first and most important survival tool. And those bodies carried them through 400,000 winters that would have killed us in our sleep. Tonight, as you lie in your warm bed, remember, every comfort you enjoy, every protection from the cold you take for granted, They earned with bodies designed by winter itself. They were evolution's answer to the question, what does it take to survive the impossible? Part 4. Tools of Ice and Stone. Hold something in your hands right now. Your phone, a pen, a coffee cup. Feel its weight, its texture, its perfectly engineered design for its specific purpose. Now imagine that same level of intentional design, that same precision engineering, carved from stone with nothing but other stones. No factories, no machines, no measurements except the knowledge passed down through generations of hands that knew their lives depended on getting it exactly right. That was Neanderthal technology, and it was breathtaking. We call it the Stone Age as if stone was somehow primitive, somehow less sophisticated than what we use today. But when your life depends on a tool, when that tool has to work perfectly in sub-zero temperatures with no backup, no replacement parts, no warranty except your own skill, then that tool becomes a masterpiece. Let me tell you about a Neanderthal scraper. Not just any scraper, but one found in a site in France, crafted roughly 60,000 years ago. It fits perfectly in your hand. The edge is sharp enough to shave hair. The grip is textured just enough for control, even with frozen fingers. The balance is so precise that you can work with it for hours without fatigue. But here's the remarkable part. They didn't make just one, they made thousands. And every one was perfectly adapted to its specific task. Scrapers for cleaning hides, scrapers for working wood, scrapers for preparing meat. Each one was a specialized instrument, crafted with the precision of a surgical tool and the durability of a tank. Think about the knowledge that went into creating such tools. They had to understand the properties of different types of stone, which flint would hold an edge longest, which obsidian would fracture in predictable ways, which quartzite could withstand the stress of heavy use. They were geologists, metallurgists, and engineers all in one. And they had to know this knowledge so thoroughly that they could apply it while cold and tired and hungry, working by firelight in a cave while the wind howled outside and their children waited for the results of tomorrow's hunt. But stone tools were just the beginning. Archaeological sites reveal the remains of wooden spears that were engineered with sophisticated understanding of physics and biology. The points were hardened in fire to penetrate thick hides. The shafts were balanced for maximum throwing distance and accuracy. The entire spear was designed as an integrated system, not just a stick with a sharp end, but a precision hunting instrument. Consider what it meant to make one of these spears. First, you had to find the right wood. Not just any wood, but wood with the right grain, the right density, the right flexibility. Then you had to season it properly, a process that could take months. Then you had to shape it, balance it, test it, refine it until it was perfect. And perfect it had to be, because when you're hunting a woolly mammoth, you don't get a second chance. Your spear either penetrates deep enough to bring down 6 tons of angry, tusked meat, or you and your family go hungry, possibly forever. But the most impressive Neanderthal technology wasn't their weapons, it was their mastery of fire. We take fire for granted, flip a switch, turn a knob, click a lighter. But for Neanderthals, fire was the technology that made all other survival possible. And they didn't just use fire, they mastered it so completely that they could create fire in conditions where modern survival experts would fail. They could make fire in rain, in snow, in high winds, with wet wood, with materials that seem impossible to ignite. Archaeological evidence shows they were creating fire consistently across hundreds of thousands of years, in climates where fire-making becomes exponentially more difficult. But they didn't just make fire, they engineered it. Different fires for different purposes. Cooking fires that would burn at specific temperatures to properly prepare meat. Warmth fires designed for maximum heat output with minimum fuel consumption. Light fires that would burn steadily through long winter nights. Signal fires that could communicate across great distances. They understood combustion science before combustion science existed. They knew which woods burned hottest, which materials created the longest-lasting coals, how to bank a fire so it would survive through the night and could be rekindled in the morning, How to create fires that would burn in the confined spaces of caves without killing everyone from smoke inhalation. Think about the engineering challenge of heating a cave. Too little fire, and your family freezes. Too much fire, and you die from carbon monoxide poisoning. The ventilation has to be perfect. The fuel has to be exactly right. The fire placement has to account for air circulation patterns that you can't see but have to understand intuitively. And they solved all of this with tools they made themselves from materials they gathered themselves, using knowledge they developed and refined over hundreds of thousands of years. Their toolkits weren't just collections of objects, they were integrated survival systems. Every tool worked with every other tool. The scraper that prepared the hide worked perfectly with the awl that punched holes for the sinew that was attached with techniques that maximized durability in extreme cold. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was approximately right. Everything was engineered for survival in conditions where approximately right meant dead. But perhaps most remarkably, they were innovators. Archaeological evidence shows their tools evolving, improving, becoming more sophisticated over time. They weren't just following ancient patterns, they were actively problem-solving, experimenting, refining their technology based on real-world results. When a spear design failed, they analyzed the failure and improved the design. When a hide preparation technique left gaps that let in cold, they developed better techniques. When a fire-starting method proved unreliable in certain conditions, they created backup methods. They were engineers working on the greatest engineering challenge in human history: how to keep your family alive in impossible conditions with nothing but stone, wood, fire, and your own ingenuity. And they succeeded. For 400,000 years, they succeeded. Their tools were extensions of their bodies, extensions of their minds, extensions of their will to survive. Every perfectly crafted point, every precisely balanced handle, every ingeniously designed joint was a love letter to life itself. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep surrounded by the technology that keeps you comfortable, remember, it all started with hands and stone and the refusal to accept that impossible means impossible. Part 5. Masters of the Hunt. Picture this scene: dawn breaking over a frozen grassland 60,000 years ago. The temperature is minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind cuts across the ice like shattered glass. And, walking across this lethal environment, a group of 8 Neanderthals are tracking something that could feed their families for a month or kill them all in minutes. They're hunting a woolly mammoth. Not just any mammoth, but a full-grown adult male standing 11 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing as much as 4 cars, armed with tusks longer than their spears and powered by muscles that could crush bones with casual ease. And they're planning to kill it using nothing but stone-tipped spears, coordination, and courage that defies comprehension. This wasn't desperation, this was expertise. This was the culmination of hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about how to turn impossible odds into dinner. Let me tell you how they did it, because the hunting strategies of the Neanderthals were masterpieces of tactical thinking that would impress modern military strategists. First, they studied their prey for days. Not just watching, but analyzing. Learning the mammoth's routines, its preferred feeding areas, its escape routes, its behavioral patterns. They observed which way it favored when threatened, how quickly it could turn, where its blind spots were, how it reacted to different sounds and movements. They were behavioral scientists conducting research where a wrong conclusion meant death. But observation was just the beginning. They had to understand the terrain as intimately as the animal. Which areas had good footing for the hunt, which had soft ground that would slow a fleeing mammoth, which had natural barriers that could be used to channel the animal's movement, which had escape routes for the hunters if everything went wrong. They were tactical planners designing a battlefield where they controlled every variable possible. Then came the tools. Not just spears, but specialized hunting equipment designed specifically for megafauna. Spear points crafted to penetrate thick hide and reach vital organs. Spear shafts balanced for throwing accuracy at specific distances. Backup spears for when, not if, The first ones broke or were lost. Cutting tools for field dressing an animal too large to move whole. They were equipment specialists preparing for the most dangerous mission possible. But the most impressive part of their hunting strategy was the coordination. These hunts required split-second timing between multiple hunters operating in extremely dangerous conditions. One hunter would drive the animal toward the others. Others would be positioned at specific angles to maximize the effectiveness of their spear thrusts. Still, others would be ready to provide backup or escape assistance if someone fell or was injured. They were special operations teams executing complex missions where failure meant not just mission failure, but team annihilation. And they had to do all of this while running across ice and snow, while their breath formed clouds that could obscure their vision, while their hands were numb with cold, while their feet fought for purchase on frozen ground. Think about the physical demands. Modern Olympic athletes train for years to develop the cardiovascular endurance, muscle coordination, and mental focus required for peak performance lasting minutes. Neanderthal hunters had to maintain that level of performance for hours in sub-zero temperatures while making life or death decisions every few seconds. But mammoth hunting was just one aspect of their hunting expertise. They were also masters of smaller game hunting, which required completely different skills. Tracking rabbits through snow required reading subtle signs invisible to untrained eyes. Hunting birds required understanding migration patterns and seasonal behaviors. Fishing through ice required knowledge of fish behavior in near-freezing water. They were generalists who had achieved mastery in dozens of different hunting specializations. Consider the risks they faced on every hunt. Beyond the obvious danger from their prey, there was the risk of injury far from help. A twisted ankle on a hunt could mean death not just for the injured hunter, but for their family back at camp, who were depending on the results of that hunt. Weather could change rapidly, turning a manageable hunt into a survival situation. Equipment could fail at critical moments. Other predators, cave bears, saber-toothed cats, packs of wolves, could appear and turn hunters into prey. Every hunt was a calculated gamble with survival itself. But here's what's most remarkable. Archaeological evidence suggests they were successful hunters. Not occasionally successful, not just barely getting by, but consistently successful enough to maintain stable populations for hundreds of thousands of years. The bone deposits around Neanderthal sites tell the story of hunting success that sustained entire communities. Mammoth bones, bison bones, horse bones, deer bones, evidence of hunts that brought home massive quantities of protein, fat, and materials for tools and clothing. They weren't just surviving on their hunting skills, they were thriving. And they shared their success. Archaeological evidence shows that successful hunts benefited entire communities, not just the hunters themselves. Meat was distributed according to social rules that ensured even the youngest, oldest, and most vulnerable members of the group received nutrition. They were not just hunters, they were providers for complex social networks that depended on their success. But perhaps most impressively, they were teachers. The hunting knowledge they developed over hundreds of thousands of years was passed down through generations with the precision of military training. Young hunters learned not just techniques, but the deep understanding of animal behavior, terrain analysis, weather prediction, and risk assessment that successful hunting required. They were running universities where the curriculum was survival, and the final exam was bringing home enough food to keep your people alive through winter. Every successful hunt was a victory against impossible odds. Every failed hunt was a lesson that improved the next attempt. Every generation of hunters was building on the accumulated wisdom of thousands of previous generations who had faced the same challenges and found ways to succeed. They were the greatest hunters in human history because they had to be. Their world didn't offer alternatives. Hunt successfully, or watch your children starve. So, they became masters. Masters of tracking, masters of tactics, masters of courage, masters of the split-second decisions that separate life from death when you're face-to-face with 6 tons of angry mammoth. And for 400,000 years, they mastered the impossible. Part 6. Shelter from Endless Winters. Imagine trying to build a house that will keep your family alive through 8 months of sub-zero temperatures, using only the materials you can gather with your hands and the tools you can make from stone. No lumber yards, no insulation, no heating systems, no architectural plans drawn up by engineers who understand thermodynamics. Now, imagine that if you get any aspect of this construction wrong, your children will freeze to death in their sleep. That was the shelter building challenge Neanderthals faced every single year for 400,000 years. And they didn't just meet this challenge, they mastered it so completely that their architectural solutions kept families alive through Ice Age winters that would kill us in our modern homes even with central heating. Let's start with their most basic shelters, caves. But calling them cave dwellers makes it sound like they just found a hole and moved in. Nothing could be further from the truth. Neanderthals were cave engineers, modifying natural spaces into sophisticated survival systems. They understood air circulation in ways that would impress modern HVAC specialists. Cold air sinks, warm air rises, and in a cave, managing these air currents meant the difference between a warm shelter and a death trap. They positioned their fires to create circulation patterns that would warm the living spaces without filling them with smoke. They built stone barriers and hide curtains to direct airflow and create separate zones for sleeping, working, and food storage. They were thermal engineers working with Stone Age materials, but many Neanderthal sites show evidence of structures that weren't caves at all. They were engineered shelters built from scratch in open locations. These weren't crude lean-tos. These were sophisticated constructions that had to solve complex engineering problems. Think about the foundation requirements. In permanently frozen ground, you can't just dig holes for support posts. The foundation has to distribute weight effectively across uneven, often unstable surfaces. Archaeological evidence shows Neanderthals created foundations using carefully arranged stones, sometimes with support systems that extended deep into the ground. They were foundation specialists working in the most challenging soil conditions on Earth. The framework of these structures was engineered for both strength and insulation. Large animal bones, mammoth ribs, skulls, leg bones, were arranged in precisely calculated patterns to create maximum interior space while maintaining structural integrity against snow loads and wind pressures that could collapse poorly designed buildings. They were structural engineers calculating load-bearing requirements without mathematics, using intuitive understanding developed over thousands of generations of trial and error. But the most impressive aspect of their construction was the covering systems. Archaeological sites reveal evidence of hide-covering techniques so sophisticated they created weatherproof barriers using only animal skins and plant materials. Multiple layers, each serving a specific function. Outer layers for wind and water resistance. Inner layers for insulation. Air gaps between layers to create thermal barriers. They were developing insulation technology that wouldn't be formally understood by science for thousands of years. Consider the challenges of working with their materials. Animal hides had to be prepared properly, or they would crack in extreme cold, letting in air that could freeze inhabitants. But prepare them wrong, and they would rot, or become too stiff to work with, or lose their water resistance. Every hide they used had to be perfectly prepared for its specific function in the shelter system. The thread they used to sew these materials together was sinew they prepared themselves from animal tendons. But sinew has specific properties. It shrinks when it dries, which could tear apart poorly designed joints. It stretches when wet, which could create gaps in waterproofing. They had to understand these properties and design their constructions to account for the behavior of their materials under different conditions. They were materials scientists working with organic compounds they had to harvest, prepare, and engineer themselves. But perhaps most remarkably, their shelters were designed for specific functions beyond just survival. Archaeological evidence shows different areas designated for tool-making, food preparation, child rearing, and social activities. These weren't just survival bunkers, they were homes where families could maintain complex social lives even during the harshest months. They were architects designing for human needs, not just human survival. Fire management within these shelters required engineering knowledge that seems almost magical today. They had to create heating systems that would warm the interior without creating carbon monoxide hazards. They had to design ventilation that would provide fresh air without letting in cold air. They had to position fires to maximize heat distribution while minimizing smoke problems. They were HVAC engineers designing systems that had to work perfectly the first time, every time. The maintenance requirements of their shelters were ongoing engineering challenges. Repairs had to be made in extreme weather conditions. Structural assessments had to account for the effects of freeze-thaw cycles on their materials. Preventive maintenance had to anticipate problems before they became life-threatening emergencies. They were facility managers maintaining critical infrastructure under impossible conditions. But here's what's most impressive. Archaeological evidence suggests their shelters were comfortable. Not just survivable, but actually comfortable enough for families to live, work, and raise children through months of conditions that would be fatal outside. Comfortable enough for elderly members to survive winters that would kill them in less sophisticated shelters. Comfortable enough for pregnant women to give birth and raise infants through the most dangerous months. Comfortable enough for communities to gather, to tell stories, to maintain the social bonds that made survival not just possible, but meaningful. Think about what that means. These weren't desperate refugees huddled together waiting for better times. These were families living full lives in shelters they had engineered to be homes. And they did it all with materials that modern survivalists would consider inadequate for a weekend camping trip. They created architectural solutions that protected human life in conditions that would challenge modern engineering, using only stone tools, animal products, and knowledge passed down through generations of builders who understood that imperfection meant death. Every shelter they built was a masterpiece of practical engineering. Every family that survived a winter in one of their constructions was testimony to building techniques refined over hundreds of thousands of years. They were the greatest architects in human history, not because they built monuments, but because they built hope. Hope that took the form of warm, dry, safe spaces where children could grow up even when the world outside wanted them dead. Tonight, in your heated, insulated, electrically lit home, remember, every comfort you enjoy started with hands building shelters from bones and stones, and the absolute refusal to let winter win. Part 7. The Inner Life of Survival. Here's what you might not expect about people living through 400,000 years of winters that could kill you. They loved their children so fiercely that they carried them through blizzards. They cared for their sick so completely that elderly Neanderthals show evidence of surviving for years after injuries that should have been fatal. They mourned their dead so deeply that they buried them with flowers. Survival, it turns out, wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying human. Let me tell you about a discovery that changes everything we thought we knew about Ice Age life. In a cave in Iraq, archaeologists found the skeleton of a Neanderthal man who had lived to be approximately 40 years old, ancient by their standards. But here's what's remarkable. He was disabled. His right arm was deformed from birth, useless for hunting or heavy labor. He was blind in one eye. He had suffered multiple injuries that would have left him unable to contribute to the physical demands of survival. And yet he lived to 40. In a world where individual survival depended on group cooperation, where resources were scarce, where every mouth to feed was a burden during the lean months, this community kept him alive for decades. Why? Because survival wasn't just about the fittest surviving, it was about the fittest making sure everyone survived. Think about what that means practically. Someone had to hunt for him. Someone had to share their food with him. Someone had to help him move when the group moved. Someone had to care for him when he was sick, protect him when he was vulnerable, include him when decisions were made. They chose compassion in a world where compassion was expensive. They chose community in conditions where individualism would have been easier, but this wasn't an isolated case. Archaeological sites across Europe and Asia show similar evidence. Neanderthals caring for disabled community members, keeping elderly people alive well past their productive years, supporting members who required more resources than they could contribute. They were building social safety nets in a world where safety itself was a daily miracle. Consider what child rearing meant in their world. Modern parents worry about playground safety and screen time. Neanderthal parents had to keep children alive in conditions where a moment of inattention could mean death from cold, predators, or accidents. But archaeological evidence suggests they didn't just keep children alive, they nurtured them. Children's remains show evidence of careful nutrition, medical care, and protection that went far beyond mere survival. These weren't children being raised to simply survive, they were being raised to thrive. Young Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of play injuries. Think about that. In a world where every calorie mattered, where every minute was potentially critical for survival, children were allowed to play enough to get injured playing. They weren't pressed into adult responsibilities the moment they could walk, they had childhoods. They were preserving innocence in a world that offered none. The teaching that went on in these communities was extraordinary. Every adult skill, hunting, tool-making, shelter building, fire starting, had to be passed down through hands-on instruction. No books, no videos, no formal schools. Just experienced adults patiently teaching children skills that would determine whether those children lived or died as adults. But they weren't just teaching techniques. Archaeological evidence suggests they were teaching complex knowledge systems. Understanding of animal behavior that required years to master, knowledge of plant properties for medicine and tools, weather prediction skills based on subtle environmental cues, geography and navigation across territories that spanned hundreds of miles. They were running comprehensive educational systems where graduation meant being qualified to keep your family alive in impossible conditions. And somehow, in the midst of all this survival pressure, they found time for what we can only call culture. Neanderthal sites contain evidence of art, music, and symbolic behavior that suggests inner lives far more complex than mere survival would require. They made jewelry from shells and teeth. They created pigments for body painting. They carved symbols into bone and stone. They made musical instruments from animal bones. Why? Because survival without meaning isn't survival, it's just postponing death. But perhaps most remarkably, they developed burial practices that suggest they understood death not just as biological failure, but as emotional loss. Neanderthal burial sites show evidence of ritual, ceremony, and grave goods that suggest they believed in something beyond immediate physical existence. At that site in Iraq, the man with disabilities wasn't just buried, he was buried with flowers. Pollen analysis shows his grave contained the remains of flowers that had to have been gathered specifically for his burial. Someone cared enough about his passing to find flowers in a world where flowers were rare, to gather them at personal cost, and to place them with his body as a final act of love. They were philosophers grappling with mortality in the harshest conditions humans have ever faced. The emotional bonds in these communities had to be incredibly strong. When your survival depends absolutely on group cooperation, when individual failure means group death, the social connections become more than just relationships, they become lifelines. Archaeological evidence suggests Neanderthal groups rarely exceeded 30 individuals. That means everyone knew everyone. Every birth was celebrated by the entire community. Every death was mourned by people who had depended on that person for their own survival. They lived in emotional intimacy that modern humans rarely experience, but that intimacy came with costs. When someone was injured, everyone felt the consequences. When someone died, everyone lost not just a friend, but a crucial component of their survival system. They carried each other's welfare as their own responsibility. The stress of their survival situation should have broken their social bonds. Competition for scarce resources should have made cooperation impossible. The constant threat of death should have created communities ruled by fear and desperation. Instead, they created communities ruled by love. Love strong enough to carry disabled members for decades. Love deep enough to gather flowers for the dead. Love persistent enough to last 400,000 years in conditions that should have destroyed every gentle human impulse. They prove that humanity isn't what you have when survival becomes easy. Humanity is what you choose when survival becomes impossible. And they chose humanity. Every day, for 400,000 years, they chose humanity. Tonight, as you fall asleep surrounded by people you love, remember that love started with people who loved each other enough to survive the unsurvivable together. Part 8. The Long Goodbye. 40,000 years ago, something extraordinary ended. After surviving 400,000 years of ice ages that would have broken any other species, after mastering conditions that seem impossible to us today, after building communities that cared for their disabled and buried their dead with flowers, the Neanderthals began to disappear, not from cold, not from starvation, not from the environmental challenges they had conquered for hundreds of millennia. They disappeared because of us. Modern humans, our direct ancestors, had arrived in Europe. And somehow, in ways we're still trying to understand, the species that had mastered winter itself could not master competition from their cousins who had spent those same millennia mastering the warm climates of Africa and the Middle East. Here's the paradox that should haunt you. The most perfectly adapted cold-weather humans in history were undone not by their environment, but by humans who were less adapted to that environment but more adaptable to change. Think about the cruel irony. Neanderthals had spent 400,000 years becoming perfect. Perfect hunters for Ice Age prey, perfect builders for Ice Age shelters, perfect survivors for Ice Age conditions. They had achieved a level of specialization that was breathtaking in its efficiency and effectiveness. But perfection, it turns out, can be a trap. When you're perfectly adapted to specific conditions, what happens when those conditions change? When new competitors arrive, when the world shifts in ways your perfect adaptations didn't anticipate, the archaeological record tells a story of gradual replacement that played out over several thousand years. Not a violent conquest, but something more like a slow fade. Neanderthal sites become less common, modern human sites become more frequent. The territories that had supported Neanderthal communities for hundreds of thousands of years gradually became occupied by people whose ancestors had never faced an Ice Age winter. But it wasn't a simple story of superior replacing inferior. In many ways, Neanderthals were superior to the modern humans who replaced them. Stronger, more cold-adapted, with bigger brains and more sophisticated tools for their specific environment. So what happened? The honest answer is we don't fully know. But the evidence suggests it was a combination of factors, each small in itself, but devastating in combination. Modern humans were more flexible. Where Neanderthals had perfected specific strategies for specific challenges, modern humans were generalists who could adapt more quickly to changing conditions. They could switch hunting strategies more easily. They could modify their tools more rapidly. They could adjust their social structures to meet new challenges. Modern humans were more connected. Their groups were larger, their trade networks more extensive, their communication systems more sophisticated. They could share innovations across great distances. They could call on resources from allied groups. They could coordinate activities on scales that exceeded anything Neanderthals had developed. Modern humans were more prolific. They had children more frequently, reached reproductive maturity earlier, lived longer lives. In a competition for territory and resources, population growth becomes a crucial advantage. But perhaps most importantly, modern humans were arriving at a time when the Ice Age world that Neanderthals had mastered was beginning to change. The climate was shifting. The megafauna they specialized in hunting was declining. The environmental conditions they were perfectly adapted to were becoming less common. They were specialists in a world that was becoming generalist. Archaeological evidence from the latest Neanderthal sites suggests they were trying to adapt. They began making tools that were more similar to modern human designs. They developed new hunting strategies. Some sites show evidence of contact between Neanderthals and modern humans, trade perhaps, or attempted cultural exchange. They were trying to learn from their competitors. But 400,000 years of perfect adaptation couldn't be changed quickly enough to meet challenges that were evolving in real time. The last known Neanderthal sites are dated to approximately 28,000 years ago in southern Spain. Small groups, Isolated populations, the final remnants of a species that had once dominated Ice Age Europe. But here's what's remarkable. Even at the end, even as their world was disappearing around them, they maintained their humanity. The latest Neanderthal sites still show evidence of care for the disabled, burial of the dead, creation of art and music. They didn't abandon their values when survival became impossible. They held on to what made them human right until the end. And they didn't entirely disappear. Recent genetic research has revealed that modern humans and Neanderthals interbred during those final millennia of coexistence. Today, most people of European and Asian descent carry Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. Their genes are still with us. Their adaptations live on in our immune systems, our metabolisms, our ability to survive in cold climates. The children you might have someday will carry genetic gifts from people who survived 400,000 winters. But more than their genes, they left us something more profound. Proof that it's possible. Proof that humans can survive anything. Proof that communities built on love and cooperation can endure through impossible conditions for impossible lengths of time. Proof that when the world wants you dead, the answer isn't to surrender, it's to become more human, not less. Every time you help someone who can't help themselves, you're honoring their memory. Every time you choose cooperation over competition, you're continuing their legacy. Every time you refuse to give up when conditions seem impossible, you're proving that their 400,000-year survival story wasn't for nothing. They were our cousins, our competitors, and in some ways, our teachers. They showed us that survival isn't about being the strongest or the smartest. It's about being the most committed to keeping each other alive. The Neanderthals are gone. But the lesson they lived for 400,000 years remains. No winter lasts forever, but the love that carries you through winter can last forever. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your warm bed, remember that you carry their story in your genes, in your capacity for endurance, in your ability to love people enough to survive the impossible with them. You are their legacy. The story kept going because you did.